at verse 19. In this section, he's beginning to talk more about the idea of wisdom and its value over wickedness or folly. So we'll begin looking at that point here. Let me begin reading here verse 19 and really going through about verse 25. It says, "Wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 rulers of the city. For there is not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin. Also, do not take to heart everything people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. For many times also your own heart has known that even you have cursed others. All this I have proven by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. As for that which is far off and exceedingly deep, who can find it out? I applied my heart to know, to search and seek out wisdom, and the reason of things, to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness." So Solomon begins here talking about this idea, the value of wisdom over anything else. And he makes the statement very early on in that the wise, having that wisdom, is of great importance to people. I want to look at it again here in it says, "Wisdom gives strength to the wise man." This is the Revised Standard. "More than 10 rulers that are in a city." So here's this idea of the power of wisdom and its greatness in life. Because it says that wisdom can give a man more power than 10 rulers in a city. And that certainly is the case. And I think there are times in the Bible you can see things of that nature where it happens. How is it that wisdom can be greater for a city than 10 rulers? And by that we're talking about 10 people, rulers of being able to lead militarily, and be able to help defend the city. But how is it that a man of wisdom can be of greater importance and greater power than 10 leaders? Sir? People listen to him. Hopefully they'll listen to him. But how does that wisdom prove to be a greater help than having 10 military leaders who are known for their abilities as leaders?
It's good to know what to do. You have to be wise to do that.
All right. Right. You know, a wise man, number one, he's going to have that ability to know in any situation what's the best thing to do. And like I said, I think there are examples given of it in the Bible. I think about things that are prophesied in the Bible about it that show that to be true, especially in light of what happened in history. But what about the destruction of Jerusalem in A.D. 70? Do what? Okay, the wisdom to get out of there. Because most people, most of the Jews there in the city, when they saw that Roman army coming, what did they do? They went into the city. Why? Yeah, for protection. You've got this wall built around you, you know, to protect you against that invading army. And plus you do have soldiers there that the Jews did have and people they could use to help defend the city. And so they were going there for protection. But a wise man advised against that. Who was it? Jesus. What did Jesus tell them to do? When you see Jerusalem encompassed by an army, flee to the mountains. Get out of there. Now, we know from history that that was the wise thing to do. Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, when he wrote about it, he said, now, and I know he exaggerates quite a bit, but he made the statement, he said that, I think he said 1,100,000 Jews were killed in the destruction of Jerusalem. But he also added, not a single Christian died. And Dan Jenkins always said he knows for a fact that no faithful Christian died. Because that faithful Christian remembers what Jesus said, and when he saw that army coming, he fled to the mountains and was saved. And so wisdom can help bring about a greater good than 10 mighty men working with you. because that wisdom can help direct you in the way that's best to ensure you of your safety and your welfare. And that's exactly what he's talking about here. Now, Solomon had something very similar to this that he talked about in Proverbs 21 and verse 22. I don't think I put that up here. Someone can read that for us, Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 22. Okay. Basically, he's saying the same thing there about that a wise man is the one who's able to scale the city of the mighty and to bring down a trusted stronghold. The wisdom that he has to know how to do it, how to bring about the destruction of that stronghold. So you need people of wisdom. Now, the one who's writing this, both here in Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, was Solomon, whom we always refer to as the wise man. Perhaps the wisest man who had ever lived, had been blessed by God with wisdom. And yet in this same section he talks about wisdom and efforts to obtain wisdom about things and understanding, and he's simply not able to do it. He says, beginning at verse 16, and we talked about not 16, excuse me, verse 20. He says, surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. Is that true? Is there no righteous men in the earth? All right. Now, he's using the word righteous here as if in context sound like nobody that's ever sinned, because that's the statement he made. There's not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. Now, there are righteous people on the earth. There were righteous people back in the Old Testament. You read about people, go all the way back in the Bible, when it talks about Noah. He's described as a righteous man. But we know he wasn't a perfect man. We know of sin in his life. But he's talking about a sinless person. And he's absolutely right. There is no sinless person. The only one that's ever been able to live that kind of life was Christ, who proved to be one who was without sin, but none of that nature. And so when he says there's not a righteous man on earth, it doesn't mean there's not anybody that's in a right relationship with God, that's considered by God to be a righteous person. But there's no righteous person in the sense of being without sin, of never having done evil. And I mentioned last week, that there have been individuals who claim to be without sin. From time to time, I've read about individuals, and I think they might have been mentally ill, who thought that they were God, and they're talking about how they had never sinned in their lives. But that's not true of any of us. So he says now, verse 21, do not give heed to all the things that men say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. Your heart knows that many times you have yourself cursed others. So the idea, don't take seriously what you hear other people talking about. In fact, it seems like Solomon's kind of advising these people, if you hear somebody talking, don't get over there close where you can hear what they're saying. Why? Yeah, that's it exactly. You might hear something you don't want to hear. It may be they're saying something about you. They may be saying something bad about you. And so whether you're talking about where you work, or you're talking about at school, or even in your home, just realize, that there may be other people who are cursing you. And then Solomon adds, he says, because even you yourself know there have been times when you've cursed others. Now, not necessarily in cursing using foul language, but cursing and speaking evil of people. Cursing in the sense of hoping something bad will happen to them. Or expressing, do you believe that they are evil people for whatever way. So, you've done that before. So be careful when you start listening to somebody else. Because you may be hearing things about yourself that you don't ever want to hear. You never intended to hear. And so you've got to be careful about that. Now, find a statement here that one person made about this. He says that Solomon is encouraging us not to be too curious about what others may be saying. You may not like what you hear, especially if it is critical of you. And here's the part I really like. It says, for peace of mind, let such trivial fussing pass. It is unworthy of attention. If you're curious and your mind gets and you come up to hear what somebody's saying, as if you're not paying attention, but you're listening, and you hear them say something bad about you, what's that going to do to you? It's going to hurt your feelings because of it. And it might make you mad because of it. And then you may say something you shouldn't be saying, and then you really got some. And see, if you could just don't pay attention to that. Ignore that entirely. If you never heard it, you'd have gone right on with your day, happy and content, and not thought anything about it. But it's when you start listening in to other people's gossip, or they're talking quietly over here, like, and you go, I've got to get over here what they're saying. And maybe they're talking quietly because you're nearby and they didn't want you to hear it anyway. So just try to ignore that. He says, you do that, he says, for the sake of peace. Whether it's in your family or your workplace, or church or school or whatever. Don't get caught up to listen to that. Now he goes on and he makes a statement here in verse 23. He says, all this I have tested by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which is far off and deep, very deep. Who can find it out? How is that possible? That a man who's been blessed by God with great wisdom, greater than any person had ever known before, how is it that he could search out for wisdom and not find it? He's human. But, God has given him such a wisdom that so many times when problems have come up, he's been able to figure it out. But now he talks about searching out things and he can't find an answer to it. Yeah, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. But, and it may be, that in a situation like this, what's happening is that in regard to the wisdom, he's searching it out. But he may be searching it out in the wrong way. He may be trying to find it by experience. And sometimes the experience we have doesn't always give us a picture of true wisdom, of solutions to problems. He could always have the solution to these problems if he was willing to ask God for it. He had asked God for wisdom, and God had blessed him with it. And the Bible teaches us, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. I think that's why it's so important when problems come up in our lives. If there's not a ready solution that we can see, we need to spend time with God, praying to God for help and understanding that to find a solution to it. And I think in this instance that Solomon hasn't been doing that. He's trying to find it out by his own experience, by his own abilities, and he can't do that. And that's why he admits, and I think it was Brother Kaufman that pointed out, this is one of those times when Solomon was absolutely honest with himself. That he searched for it and he just couldn't find it. But he's searching for it in the wrong way. He said, I turned my mind to know and to search out and to seek wisdom and the sum of things and to know the wickedness of folly and the foolishness which is madness. Well, I think, he's done that through experience. He's been trying that. He's been trying to find out, first of all through wine, trying to find that wisdom. And I think that's one of the times when he found, he says here, he came to know the wickedness of folly, behaving foolishly, and the evil of it. He tried to find it through his riches. He tried to find it through power. He tried to find it through building up, all these beautiful things for himself to enjoy and all that he had for his pleasure. And you just don't find it that way. That way leads you to finding the wickedness, the folly, and the foolishness, he says, which is madness. And so, we need to learn to trust in God, to seek out God's will. And there are a lot of times, the answer can be found right here in the Bible. But the problem is, it takes a little effort. Maybe, there may be a solution to a problem here in the Bible, but where in the world do I go to find it? What's the chapter and verse for it? And you may have to search it out. You have to do a lot of reading, a lot of studying to find it. But again, that's one of the times when we need to be praying to God and seeking God's help in that regard. Now, as he goes on, this next little section here, verses 26 through 29, he talks about really what is called the wickedness of womanhood. He makes a statement beginning here in verse 26. I thought I'd put that up there. All right. Verse 26, and I found more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God escapes her, but the sinner is taken by her. Behold, this is what I found, says the preacher, adding one thing to another to find the sum, which my mind has sought repeatedly, but I have not found. One man among 1,000 I found, but a woman among all these I have not found. Behold, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many devices. His opinion of women, as it's given there, he said, I found more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and whose hands are fetters. You look in the book of Proverbs, chapter 5 and 7 and parts of chapter 6 are some strong warnings that Solomon gives to his son. And they're warnings primarily about wicked women and the need to avoid them. He talks about those who are harlots, who are very skillful and crafty and luring people into having sexual relations with them. And he talks about the troubles that it brings to you in your life. So he understood about it, but how well did he practice what he knew and what he taught his children? Yeah, didn't practice it very well at all. How many wives did he have? 700. And how many concubines? 300. And most of those were foreign women. And these were the ones that led him away from God, that led him to worshiping idols, to the extent of building idols or setting up altars for these idols like Molech, to whom the people would sacrifice their children unto those gods to be burned alive. So he understands the danger of it. They can be snares, but he hasn't been very good at following his own advice. Now, yes, sir.
It's kind of interesting in verse 28 where he says, one man I found among 1,000 and women none, and he named exactly the number of women he had there.
Right. Yeah. Now, I don't think that's an accident. I think that's intense. And I think the idea was, out of all these women, he feels like I haven't found any of them that's trustworthy. Now, he said, maybe out of 1,000 men, I might find one that I would deem to be trustworthy, someone I could rely upon, but not one woman out of 1,000. Well, who? Solomon? Every husband is trustworthy, you know. No, he wasn't trustworthy. And he made so many mistakes in his life and everything. And it was just like so many times we can know what's right sometimes, but we don't always choose to do what's right. And that's the way it was with Solomon here. Now, yeah, and see, again, that wisdom he's trusting there is not wisdom that came from God. He's got that. He's taught his sons about it, but he's trying it by another way. And it just is not going to work out that way. Now, I believe that at least it's evident to me here that when Solomon makes this statement, he's speaking out of actual experience that he's had in life. And his condemnation, as it were, of these women, it's not because, that doesn't mean that women can't be trusted. But sometimes, we can become so caught up, so in maybe with all these women he's had who have been untrustworthy too. Of course, they worship these different gods, these different idols. You can't expect them to be like someone is grown up learning about God and living for God the way he should, that you could trust. But these are women that have not been raised that way. And so you can't really expect anything different out of them. But he has, and he's been disappointed in it. And so that's why he speaks out the way he does. And I think there are times in life when things like that happen, we tend to become kind of cynical about things. It might happen, somebody have two bad relationships, and he just comes to the conclusion, well, that's the way it is with women, period. You can't trust any of them. That happens a lot of times in life. I have found myself at times thinking that way toward politicians. You've heard the statement before. How do you know if a politician is lying? His lips are moving. Now, see, that is saying, in effect, you can't trust a single politician. If he's a politician, as soon as you open his mouth, he's lying to you. And there are a lot of people that feel that way about different things. They may feel that way about used car salesmen. Maybe they've been taken a time or two. Maybe they've been cheated. And they'll feel that way. Well, they become cynical. As far as they're concerned, that's it. They're all like that. Well, that's not the case. And not necessarily that they really believe that everybody's like that, but it's just because they have been themselves, they've been hurt by it, they tend to get that way. And I think that's what's happening to Solomon here. He's been hurt so many times by these women that he speaks that way. But later on, we have here the book Song of Solomon that he writes, a Song of Songs. And what's that book all about? Yeah, the love that he has for this Shulamite woman who's different. And when you read his talking about her and the obvious love and concern that he has for her, he doesn't consider her to be a chain or a snare like he's talked about here. And so I think maybe it's not that he really believes that all women are untrustworthy. I think he's just become cynical about it, like happens so many times with us. If we've been hurt by somebody or some group, then we just think they're all like that. And that's not the case. And so that's the problem that he has here. Some people have accused Solomon of being misogynist. He hates women. And I don't think that's necessarily true. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. No. I know that's the first thing I think. I think Lemuel wrote that one about the godly woman there. Yes, sir. Right. Yeah. But again, I think that's one of those series where, I believe if he had asked God for help in that. Because again, that's going to get into, leading the nation in the right way. When you start setting the wrong example for other people by marrying these foreign women, that's going to lead the country off. And so, he could have gotten God's help in that. I think if he'd have really put God first. Now, the last thing in this chapter, I think it's one of the more important statements that Solomon makes in the book, and that's in verse 29. Now, it's after you got through that, out of 1,000 men, maybe I found one that's trusted. 1,000 women, none. But then he says, verse 29, behold, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many devices. There's no doubt that he's true. He's accurate in that. That's what the Bible teaches, that God created man upright. You go back to the book of Genesis, to the days of creation, days 1 through 5. At the end of each of those days, God says that he saw what he had created, and it was good. Then on day 6, creating the beasts of the field and creating man and woman. At the end of the day, what did God say about his creation? It was very good. So everything that God created, and that included man, mankind was very good. Mankind, they were not created evil. They were not created in sin. And neither are children, when they're born in this world, born in sin. They come forth as righteous as Adam and Eve were when God created them. But the problem is, he says, that man has sought out many devices. Now, what do you think he's talking about there? Some translations even have many inventions. Schemes, okay. Like I said, some translations say inventions. There have been some people say, oh, yeah. You see man invent anything. You get Tubal Cain and them, the inventor of, was he the one that invented instrumental music? Instruments, and different things that mentions about them. But that's not what he's talking about. The schemes that men come up with. I think men are looking for more and more ways to sin, to do whatever they can sinful to please themselves. And I say that a couple of verses here. Let's see if I can get. All right. All right. That's 7:29. Now, Genesis 1:31, God saw everything that he had made. Indeed, it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the 6th day. In Romans 1:30, where Paul is given a list, about 30 different things of evil things that the Gentiles were guilty of. And I put this verse up there because notice it says, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents. Honestly, it seems like that throughout history, man has not been satisfied with the old ways of sinning. He's always looking for something new, something that can be more exciting to him, more alluring and more tempting. I think it's kind of like maybe with drugs. I've heard people say, you can get so used to one drug you don't get the high you used to, and so you got to find something else that'll stimulate you even more than that. And I think it's that way with just about any sin. People get tired of it, and I'm not going to get into it, but some of the books that I've read, I can't remember the preacher's name, denominational preacher, and talking about homosexuality and talking about what homosexuals actually do. And it's just like, it's getting worse and worse and worse, because they're not satisfied with the old way of sinning, and keep going on. Other passage, 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 13. If someone will turn that and read for us. 2 Timothy 3 and verse 13. Darnell, if you can read that for us, please.
While evil people and impostors will go on from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived.
Okay. Going from bad to worse. Some translate, worse to worse. In other words, instead of people getting better, these people are getting worse and worse. John Waddy, Brother Waddy made this statement about it. He says, man has corrupted himself by seeking out evil things and doing them. Modern man is still busily engaged in a frenzied attempt to out-sin his progenitors. And I think that's basically what we're talking about here. God created man upright, but he sought out many inventions. Yes. Yeah, it's getting worse and worse. So maybe compared to the... Yeah. Yeah. They weren't good. It's just gotten worse. Yeah. So, I think that's important because, we have a lot of people today in the world that teaching the faith that children, when they're born, are born evil. They're born guilty of sin. And that, they have the sin of Adam they've inherited. And everybody, they say, when you're born, you have that sin of Adam on you already. But I think this verse shows, no, just as Adam and Eve were created evil, everybody else that's created without sin, created right, everybody else that's created through the natural birth process are also created good. But as they grow, the statement is made in Psalms about those who go astray from the womb telling lies. Now, they'll take that first part, go astray from the womb, and say, well, you're born that way. Well, no one it says they go astray. And they don't become sinners immediately after being born. They go astray telling lies. When they get to that age in life where they know the difference between the truth and the lie, and they choose to lie anyway, then they're guilty of sin, and they're going astray. They're not born that way. And I think it's important to recognize here when he says this, that God created man upright, but they've sought out many inventions. They've sought out more and more ways to sin. Okay, now, beginning chapter 8, and the subject matter changes. He begins talking here now more about expediency of living in an imperfect world. Choosing the best things to do in a world that's not perfect. Now, when you think about that, I really believe that this world is perfect, given consideration the reason that God had for creating it. God did not create this world to be a place where no accidents would ever happen, nobody would ever get sick. But it's created in such a way that it proves to be the ideal situation, the ideal place for man to be tried, to be tested. And that's what we're going through in this life. We're going through a period of trial to see how we respond in our life, of how we serve God or not. But it's an imperfect world because of sin that man has brought into the world by his acts. And so what do you do when you're living in a world like this? In this world, whereas he's going to point out there are things about it that's hard to understand, and it just doesn't seem right that it should be that way. So in this chapter, he starts giving advice on how to live in such an imperfect world. Some people see the things in this life that aren't right, and they decide, boy, I'm going to change everything. But you can't change everything. Nobody has that ability or power to change everything. And by that, I'm talking about changing things that you can't make this world perfect where nobody ever gets sick. When I see those advertisements on TV for Jude Hospital, St. Jude Hospital, with those children suffering from cancer, that's one of the hardest things in the world to watch and think, boy, if I just had the power, there wouldn't be anything like that. But we don't have the power to do that. We can't change that. But some people, we're so intent, they want to change everything, and they don't have the power to do it. And because of that, life becomes such a disappointment and a misery to them. There are other people who see things around that are wrong and could be changed and need to be changed, but they don't do anything to do it, to change it. And again, I think their life is going to be miserable because of that. I can't remember whether it was Augustine or not that made the statement. Let me see, I think I wrote it down here, but I'm not sure if he's the one that said this. Lord, give me the courage to change the things I can, humility to accept the things I can't change, and wisdom to know the difference. And I think that when you get here to this chapter, one of the things you're going to be looking at is that very idea that he's talking about here, that of being able to do that. So, first of all, in chapter 8, he begins talking about the need of accepting authority. And we'll see why. We're going to see what brings that about. Yeah, and can't see much on that, can we? All right. Need to accept the authority of the king. Chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. Who is like a wise man, and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the sternness of his face is changed. I say, keep the king's commandment for the sake of your oaths to God. Do not be hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand for an evil thing, for he does whatever pleases him. Where the word of a king is, there is power. And who may say to him, what are you doing? He who keeps his command will experience nothing harmful, and a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment. Now, first of all, he's talking here, I think, about the need of being loyal to the king, as he talks about it here. Solomon, of course, being the king. And you need to be loyal. Well, why is that the case? Why do you need to be loyal to the king and obey him? Well, something he points out here, you've got to recognize the king is the one that has power. Okay? And he decides what's going to be done, and he does what he wants to be done. So, you've got to be careful how you behave in the king's presence. And he makes a statement here about an oath. Let's see, that's at verse... verse 2. Keep the king's command, and because of your sacred oath, be not dismayed. What oath do you think he's talking about here? An oath to God? To serve God? Yeah. I was thinking of something different. And this translation doesn't say anything about an oath to God. It says a sacred oath. Any oath that we make. Remember, we've talked about this. How that you're not required to take vows or make vows. That's making a promise under oath. You're not required to do it. But if you do it, you need to keep it. Now, sometimes a person is required to take an oath to the king. You've got to make certain promises of what you're going to do. And he's telling you, look, if you make that oath, take that oath to the king, you need to be careful about going back on that and not keeping that oath. And I think, there are different reasons why that could be the case. Why you need to be loyal and obedient that you're given. One might be tempted to desert the king in time of danger. Maybe you promise to support the king. Just like when a person goes in the armed service or takes leadership positions in our nation, he takes an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States. Military people have to take an oath to defend this country. But it's easy to make it when everything's nice and quiet and peaceful, but what about if you go to war? And all of a sudden, there may be people who frightened by that, may give up that oath and just maybe desert, maybe go AWOL or whatever, and they're not going to keep it. And so there may be times when, because of dangers, you may be persuaded to do that. Or one might be tempted. A second thing here, might be tempted to desert the king when things begin to go wrong. Maybe when you first began serving the king, boy, it was pretty good. You had a lot of privileges that you had, and the position you were in, everything was fine and peaceful. But now when things go wrong, I think about, in politics, economy's great, going up, and people are making more and more money, and we're at peace. And then something happens, and all of a sudden it starts going down. And it's not fun anymore. And everybody's complaining and griping about it, and you don't like it. So you may be tempted, to give up supporting the king and turn against him. I was trying to look at things in the Bible. In 2 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 30, this was a time when things started going bad for David as king. His son, Absalom, has rebelled against him. And when that happens, there are those who had been supporters of David, even some who had been counselors to David, who turn against him. And they desert him. And they go over to helping his son Absalom. One of those men was a man by the name of Ahithophel. And in chapter 15 and verse 30 of 2 Samuel is when word is brought to David and say, hey, Ahithophel has deserted you. He's gone now in support of your son Absalom. Well, why would he do that? well, hey, David's fixing to be on the run. You know, Absalom has persuaded the people to join with him, and he has a greater force, and David has to flee for his life. And so Ahithophel said, hey, I'm not for going out and living in the wilderness and hiding in caves. I'm staying here, and I'm going to serve Absalom as king. Keep my position and have things the way it was. So there may be times when things aren't going good that a person might be tempted to leave the king. One might be tempted to desert the king if he's not pleased with the king and what he was doing. In that same respect, there were those at that time, one man by Shimei, when David is fleeing, you know, he's not been happy with what David did in taking over since Saul had been king and Saul's been killed and David's taken over. He didn't like that. And so he starts fussing at David and cursing David as he goes along because he's not happy with what David had done. One might be tempted to desert the king for some better offer or job. You know, hey, that would be one reason to do it. Give up support for that king and serving him because I've got something better. But what Solomon does, and what he's reminding the people of here, the king had full authority over them. And you need to be careful in a situation like that. It's what you're doing. Because of that, he does have that authority over you. And that authority could bring about your downfall or your death. Well, that's then living under King Solomon and what might happen. And back then, kings did have absolute rule. They could and often did put people to death for any reason they wanted. But today,